Carlos Zorilla is both the founder and coordinator of DECOIN, which is the Defense of Ecology and Conservation of the Intag network, which has been operating since 1995. DECOIN has created 41 community-controlled reserves, 37 community watershed reserves, delivered environmental education, and developed a number of social enterprises. DECOIN has helped establish the first ecological county in Latin America in September of 2000, creating a model of sustainable development for Latin America. In 2009, DECOIN supported local residents to present a massive lawsuit against Copper Mesa Mining Corporation and the Toronto Stock Exchange for violence and human rights violations. And in 2020, it has won the first round of a landmark rights of nature case related to the proposed copper and molybdenum mine in Luramagua. We'll hand over to you now, Carlos, and have a little bit of a discussion about what led you to create DECOIN and how you went about it.
Yeah, well, again, thank you for doing this. It's really important to get the word out and get more nations and people behind supporting the rights of nature all over the world. Yeah, DECOIN, it was an organic creation. We had a problem here of a mining company hanging around some forest in the Junin area, which is about 15 kilometers in a straight line as a parrot flies from where I am speaking right now. And no one knew anything about it. So we held a meeting here in my house between two groups, and this issue came up. What should we do about this mining company? And then we proposed to create a new organization to confront the mining threat, but also really there are a lot of other problems, deforestation, uncontrolled deforestation, mostly uncontrolled deforestation. But our focus has been stopping mining development during this past almost 26 years. So that was the impetus to create DECOIN, and that's what we've been doing, protecting a lot of forest. Like you said, 41, I'm not sure if it's 41 or 38 community watershed and forest reserves that are protecting 12,000 hectares of primary, secondary forest. A lot of these forests are on the boundary of one of the world's most biodiverse protected areas, the Cotacachi-Cayapas National Park. And all of these forests are within the buffer zone of this really biodiverse area. And this is where thousands of Intag residents get their drinking water. So there is a need to protect these forests. That was our intention from the beginning. We need to get local communities directly involved in conservation. So as a consequence, this model of development, that we turn over all the deeds to the communities and the local government. We don't own any forest at all. It doesn't work, foundations or organizations owning forests in places like Ecuador. People have to have a stake, direct stake in conservation. So that's what we do. And that's one of the things we've done. We've also helped create, as you mentioned, sustainable economic activities. The shade-grown organic coffee project was born right here also. And we supported the community of Junin, which is the community on the front lines of battling the transnational copper mining companies. We helped them create an ecological tourism model development. They have their own cabin. We bought forests for them. And we're also involved in environmental education with kids. So there's a lot that we've done, and I don't want to take up too much time. So if anybody has questions later, I'll be glad to go into detail some of the work we do.
Thank you, Carlos. And also, I need to back up a little bit. I'm sorry, I forgot to acknowledge that I'm coming to you presenting from Nam, which is Wurundjeri land, and I need to acknowledge that that is where This conference is mostly being coordinated out of, although it's very international and we have people coming in from all around the world. And DECOIN has done so much work in the last 25 years that it's very hard, I understand, to summarize all of that. And it's, you know, been part of a broader movement and network in Ecuador. And this has led up to the rights of nature being enshrined in Ecuador's constitution. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about what the atmosphere was, or what the conditions were that led up to that constitutional enshrinement of the rights of nature.
Yeah, that was actually a really interesting chapter in this resistance. When they started rewriting the Constitution in 2007, we were able to get a few busloads of Intag residents to travel to Montecristi on the coast, where there were these people that were elected to rewrite the Constitution working. And we met with some of these drafters of the Constitution to let them know what we felt about conservation, and specifically mining versus conservation. So we met, for example, with Alberto Acosta, which is the first time I met him, and he was one of the promoters of the rights of nature within the context of the rewriting of the Constitution. And the people from Intag were able to sit and talk to people like Alberto Acosta and directly translate their concern about what was going on with mining specifically, but in general conservation. We also went there as part of a broader organization called the Asamblea Nacional Ambiental, the National Environmental Assembly. So we were able to bring a lot of environmentalists to talk to the drafters of the new Constitution, and to make sure that the Constitution had a strong environmental and conservation focus. And I think we were able to do that. And I was actually surprised that they went as far as enshrining the rights of nature. It was more than we expected, but we are really more than happy that it made it through, because it was not easy. When we were there were lobbyists from the mining company and the petroleum company every single day while they were rewriting the Constitution, meeting with these drafters. We were told that because there were people who were assistants to the drafters of the Constitution who told us, and they say, you know, it's great you guys come, but you should stay. You should stay here every day, because the mining lobby, especially, they mentioned the mining lobby, was especially active in the rewriting of the Constitution. But at least we got that right enshrined, and it was it's a whole different history now.
And obviously, there's been a number of challenges with interpreting that law, which we can go into a little bit later in more detail. But that same year, DECOIN was also involved in a landmark case of going to Canada, a country that has a lot of mining companies that come into Ecuador, and suing the stock exchange, which is an extraordinary step. Was that something that you were bolstered by the legal developments in Ecuador to do, or was that happening on its own? What led you to do that, and what did you learn from that?
You really want to know? I was just really pissed at the mining companies. One of the things mining companies do to neutralize the opposition is to cut off funding. So I thought, why not use that philosophy against the mining company? Try to cut off funding so they stop violating our rights. And I was in Canada. At that time, I went there to do some research, and I met with a team of lawyers. And I was amazingly enough, able to convince them to take on the Toronto Stock Exchange. And based on human rights violation. And our argument was that the company was getting money through the Toronto Stock Exchange and violating our rights. And we warned the Toronto Stock Exchange before the mining company was listed, which is something all environmentalists and activists should keep an eye on. We warned the Toronto Stock Exchange, this company is violent and they will violate our rights. And sure enough, they did it. That's why the judge, the court in Canada accepted the lawsuit, because the Toronto Stock Exchange was warned and they went ahead and made millions of dollars available to the company. They spent $40 million in Ecuador, most of it here in Intag, to try to neutralize the opposition. But they were never even able to access their mining concession. The community stopped them. The communities here in Intag are really organized and really focused. And they stopped them over and over again until it just got crazy. And they got really aggressive with judicial setups. I was set up. I almost ended up in jail. They hired paramilitaries to try and go into the mining concessions. They shot at civilians. They violated all kinds of rights, but nothing happened. And all this was shown to the court, what these mining companies in Canada especially, what they do with money when they are allowed to trade in stock exchanges. So it set a precedent in Canada. It was the first one for communities to sue the Toronto Stock Exchange. We lost because the lawyer said, look, the Canadian mining lobby is very strong here, but we may be able to set a precedent. And we lost the case, but the company was kicked out of Toronto Stock Exchange, which meant they had no money. So we were successful in drying up their funding. So it was overall very, very positive.
And much more recently, you've been involved in another precedent court case with Luramagua. Maybe you could tell us a little bit about what that court case is and what the outcome means.
Right. Yeah, it's difficult for me to see these things out of context because the latest lawsuit, it's actually been over a year in the making. We've been studying the best timing to present the case, talking with allies and so on. It took a long time to prepare a case. And it's one of dozens of measures that we have used to try and stop mining development in this really beautiful biodiverse area of the Northwest Ecuador. So this specific case, the Yurimawa is the name of the mining concession, and it belongs to the Ecuador State Mining Company, ENAMI, and is being operated by Codelco, the world's largest copper producer, which is based in Chile. Very, very powerful mining company. So we are always looking for arguments, strong arguments, to present to the public and the court as to why there should be no mining here. And we knew there were endangered species in there, but I thought that maybe we had a good chance of finding new species if we could somehow finance an environmental biological inventory. So I got a little bit of money from Rainforest Concern in the UK, and I hired this, DECOIN hired this foundation in Quito called Hambatu. They specialize in amphibians. Why amphibians? I thought if we were to find a new species, would probably be amphibians. Ecuador has incredible diversity and amount of amphibians, especially frogs. And it was just unbelievable. But the first night they were there, they rediscovered a species that was considered extinct, and that's called the long-nosed harlequin frog. The first night they were there, that was in 2016. And then 3 years later, as a consequence of the rediscovery, they found another even rarer amphibian called the confusing rocket frog, Ectopoglossus confusus. It is the biologist who found it said it's like, imagine walking into a lost valley and running into a dinosaur. It's that rare. So once the scientific studies are published, it's going to make a lot of waves. This is a really, really ancient lineage of amphibian. It's going to create a lot of waves. So we know with these two discoveries, we thought, well, now the time is right to present the lawsuit. And also the fact that the courts are more independent now than they were with the last government. There was no independence of power with the Correa government. So everyone said it would be a waste of time presenting lawsuits during this period. So we decided this was the time to present the lawsuits using the rights of nature. One of our main argument is that the continuation of mining exploration, there is no exploitation yet, there's just exploration. We argue that if exploration is allowed to continue, it will definitely, inevitably lead to the extinction of these two species of frogs and others that are critically endangered. I mean, we're talking one of the most biodiverse places in the world, and there are dozens of endangered animal species within this 5,000 hectare mining concession. So that's what we asked. We were able to convince the judge, a woman judge. Unbelievable. This is the first time it's ever happened in our province, and one of the very few times the rights of nature case has been successful. The judge agreed with us and said that sure enough, these species have a right to exist, even though humans may not really care about it. And the judge gave a time limit to the mining company, and they have to show not only to the government, but to the local government, to universities and the public ombudsman, that the measures that they're going to implement can secure the livelihood and the persistence of these species, which may be very, very difficult for them to prove that. So we won, the government will appeal. I am sure we're going to win in the appeal because it's actually harder to win on the lower courts because the judges are much more likely to be pressured by the mining companies and the government, because the government is a very active participant in this lawsuit. We sued the Ministry of the Environment and the Attorney General's office. So the government has a lot of interest in this mining project to go ahead. So there's going to be a lot of pressure on the judges. And usually it's the lower court judges that are more susceptible to these pressures. So we're really, really, really lucky and very, very happy that we won at the lower courts.
It's so exciting and is such a precedent, and we'll hopefully see that beautiful and richly biodiverse area that you've been fighting to protect for so long protected from mining threats into the future. And I want to thank you so much for all of the work that you have done through DECOIN and independently as well to protect such a precious place. So the court, they have until around Christmas, I think you said, to present their appeal arguments if they have any. Is that right?
Yeah, here in Ecuador, it really is completely up to the judge to continue the procedures. I'm hoping that by Christmas, the government, the judge will let the procedure go ahead. And by the beginning of the year will be, that's what our lawyers are saying, but the beginning of 2021, we should be at the appeal at the Superior Court of our province. So we will be counting on support from everyone that's plugged in now to try get this case to be better known and to try and get a more positive ruling. And by the way, it's not only DECOIN. There's a lot of people and organizations, as you could probably imagine. It's not only me or DECOIN. There's been a lot of people, especially the community at the community level. I mean, imagine persisting 26 years against, it's now 4 mining companies. We kicked out 2 mining companies, the Japanese in the 90s, the Canadians in 2009. And now we're confronting 2 national mining companies. So it's an amazing amount of work and persistent by the people underground and allied organizations here in Intag, but all over the world.
Thank you so much, Carlos. We will have to continue with our other panelist members, and then people can write questions they have about how to help know more about the case, or any other questions they may have in the chat, and we'll come back to them. But thank you so much, and yeah, really appreciate all the work that you've done in this space.
Thank you. Thank you all.
And our next presenter is Liz Downs, who has written the most modest bio I've ever seen and is the director of the Rainforest Information Centre and a campaigner for the Melbourne Rainforest Action Group, and has titled herself full-time random activist with a background and skill set of international grassroots project work, especially around Latin America, writing, environmental campaigning, deep ecology and guerrilla gardening, and currently living in Luricha, Tasmania. Welcome and thank you for joining us, Liz.
Thanks, Ney. Yeah, I'd just like to start by acknowledging that I'm living on the stolen lands of the NENA people in Lutruwita, so-called Tasmania, and I acknowledge elders past, present and future.
Yeah, so I think we were going to invite you to share a little bit about the work of the Rainforest Information Centre and the Melbourne Rainforest Action Group, both very important organisations in Australia.
Cool. Yeah, so I mean, briefly, the Rainforest Information Centre is a grassroots organisation that started with John Seed, who's quite well known nowadays, with the success of Australia's first rainforest blockade in 1979 in Terania Creek in northern New South Wales, and they've been pretty much supporting frontline struggles, mainly around, providing funding and volunteers at a very, low key sort of level. And in Ecuador, and the Melbourne Rainforest Action Group was one of many rainforest action groups around the country and the world for RIC, or the Rainforest Information Centre. And we did a kind of fundraiser for Los Cedros in 2018 and in Melbourne, and resurrected ourselves to take on the Ecuador mining campaign, which we're currently heavily involved in. So yeah, Rainforest Information Centres, I wanted to just bring in the Ecuador link because we started in Ecuador with helping the local communities establish the Los Cedros Biological Reserve in 1989. Brought a few volunteers over, raised some money, helped the locals start a management committee, quickly branched out into other projects around Ecuador, mainly around working with different indigenous groups around establishing a form of territorial boundaries, actually, so they could protect their lands better from oil and and other extractive industries. So yeah, and
yeah, and so more recently, there's obviously the case and involvement around the Los Cedros Biological Reserve has really picked up. Maybe you could tell us a little bit about what that reserve is, the Rainforest Information Centre's connection to it and what's happening or how the court case has come about.
Okay, I'll give a bit of context here. I'll bring MRAG in a little bit more. So in 2017, I was actually in Ecuador at the time, working mainly in the Amazon area, but got an email to the network saying, oh my God, we found out that about 2 million hectares of forests, like biodiverse forests and indigenous lands in Ecuador have been concessioned over to international mining companies. That, of course, includes the area that Carlos was talking about. So we've been working with Carlos as well on these same issues. We found out that, the biggest investment in monetary terms is actually Australian. And we have about 7 or 8 different Australian mining companies, some of them, BHP, Twiggy Forest, Gina Reinhardt, they've all been completely ransacking mainly Aboriginal lands here. So, yeah, they're going over to Ecuador and basically plundering Ecuador now. And so it's a really big issue. It's not just Los Cedros, it's the whole shebang. Los Cedros is under concession mainly to a Canadian company called Cornerstone Capital Resources, co-owned by the Ecuadorian State Mining Company. BHP has a corner of it as well. So anyway, we were like, okay, where do we even start? There's nobody else currently, I guess internationally, I mean, apart from working with individual groups, taking on this whole thing as a whole and really getting this entire picture out to the world that we've got this massive problem with extractivism that's burgeoning in Ecuador, mainly because Ecuador's copper reserves are greenfields, they're virgin. Companies have only just discovered that all this copper is there. Anyway, so Los Cedros, Rick already had an investment there, so we just thought, well, we can at least start with Los Cedros. We can start developing a campaign around that. Melbourne Rainforest Action Group came on board. We've basically been working mainly in the wider mining space, writing a lot of reports on the Australian mining companies, just trying to kick the issue out there. Trying to support the locals with funding if we can raise it. Los Cedros exploded this year because the Constitutional Court, so Los Cedros won a case at the provincial level last year. It was an action for protection to kick the mining companies out. They'd already started exploring by that point. Unfortunately, the mining companies ignored that action for protection and said it was illegitimate and we're going to, explore anyway and, stuff for you guys, basically. So the next thing that happened was the Constitutional Court decided to hear the case as a precedent case for applying the rights of nature to protecting forests that are technically, this is about 2 million hectares we're talking about. They're technically protected under secondary laws in Ecuador. However, under the mining push, the mining lobby, the national mining plan, those environmental laws have been weakened and eroded to the point of almost no return. Also, we're talking about not only environmental laws, but laws protecting free, prior and informed consent of communities, human rights, that kind of thing, have all been eroded. So the Constitutional Court wants to get the right, to see if they can use the rights of nature to help override some of these lower laws with, it's very difficult to get rights of nature. The problem with the rights of nature in Ecuador, as Carlos will testify as well, is that it has been very, very difficult to win cases. It's been very difficult for judges and to know what the rights of nature even is or means. There's virtually no legislation that bridges the gap between these really great constitutional laws and, you know, actually protecting environments and people on the ground. So anyway, so that's the kind of what we're embroiled in now with Los Cerdos. Do you want me to go on about where we're at with the case now? I'm just rambling on now. You're on mute.
Yeah, sorry about that. Yeah, so the case is imminently happening. All of the submissions were received, is it 2 weeks ago now?
Yeah, 2 weeks ago. So the public hearing was about a month ago. We had, there were about 76 amicus curiae presented from all over the world, got biologists very excited, got you know, scientists of all kinds, got local people who, the thing about Los Cerdos is, like all of these areas, it's a source of drinking water for hundreds of communities. There's a lot of community investment in protecting these areas. So they were presenting briefs. We had, yeah, so, and then, yeah, so we're now waiting for a ruling, and this ruling, it's very much on tenterhooks, because at the hearing, the mining companies, and you heard Carlos talk about how stubborn they are in presenting their arguments. What the mining companies mainly argued was rights for investors, investment rights, and what's known as juridical security. Basically, in plain English, this means that the mining companies were threatening to sue Ecuador if the state doesn't try and protect their investments. And this has happened before in Ecuador. Chevron famously sued the state a couple of years ago and won, and basically got out of cleaning up a horrific toxic waste oil contamination situation in the Amazon area. So it can happen once, it could happen again. So they were arguing that, and the defense was arguing that rights of nature being constitutional should override investment security, because these rights are inalienable. We're working with a UK barrister who's actually from indigenous Peruvian descent, and she's been passionately arguing the case on the basis that Ecuador not only has constitutional laws, but these constitutional laws are tied to international treaties, environmental treaties, human rights treaties, the Paris Agreement, UNESCO's National and Cultural Heritage 1992, all kinds of treaties. And so they've got no argument. This is what the defense is saying, to try and put investment rights first. And this is why it's kind of a landmark case, because this is talking about a big picture way to try and, you know, we can either have grassroots communities struggling on for, you know, fighting case by case and you know, struggling to raise the $20 or $30 or $50,000 needed to pay the lawyers to get these cases to court over and over and over again. Or we can try and also change, you know, work out how to use the system to afford more protections of these areas. So that's where we're at the moment.
It's so big, it's so hard to get my head around the significance of the rights of nature as a movement and its implications, the significance of it being heard in the Constitutional Court, which, as you said, is the highest court in the land. There's a lot of legal speak involved that is also quite confusing, but the possibilities, if this case wins, and the implications and the precedent set are very far-reaching and would be an example of the rights of nature in action, as they could be. So, you know, for full disclosure, I'm, you know, very involved in this case through working with Melbourne Rainforest action group as well, and it's such a magnificent and special place, as that area is just so biodiverse and special, which is why people have been fighting so hard to protect it, despite mining companies coming back again and again. And somebody explained to me, actually, Kirsten from Mining Watch Canada was explaining that part of that push of getting the rights of nature into the Constitution was because people just get so tired that they just keep having to fight. So this is a real turning point. And I guess, you know, it's so imminently happening right now. I guess I really want to focus on or ask what the best ways people can get involved in this case now. I think that, you know, there's a Twitter-a-thon happening this week. This is quite significant, definitely in Ecuador, but also globally. So we will speak with, we will be passing over to Michelle Maloney to speak a bit more about the rights of nature movement in Australia and some of those progressions. But for now, for people who are tuning in, what would you say for the best ways to support this really important case?
Okay, I did have slides, but it just fries my brain too much to try and look for them and talk at the same time, unless I put them in the chat when I've stopped talking, maybe. So yeah, at the publicity is a really big thing, and it's not just, it's raising awareness. We've, I mean, the case that Carlos spoke about before is quite close to Los Cedros, and in some ways it's actually, it's certainly equally as important, if not more, in terms of, you know, using a slightly different legal structure, you know, focusing on endangered, both Los Cedros and the Urumaga case have focused on the rights of particular critically endangered endemic species. So getting the, you know, we share a lot on Facebook. We're trying to use social media. We lack people power because the Melbourne Rainforest Action Group, again, full disclosure, consists of currently 5.5 volunteers who work really, really hard for nothing. And you know, we have a diverse skill set, but sometimes we're just like, oh, you know, none of us here really know how to use Twitter properly. And so I'll put a few links on the chat, just, you know, for people to just hop on and share stuff. It's really important. Twitter-thons are all about getting the Justicia Los Cedros hashtag up trending in Ecuador, because Ecuadorians, you know, they're fighting a huge battle, massive battle. We've got these a total of 3 million hectares just about under mining concession. That's not just forests and indigenous lands. It also includes quite heavily populated areas, water source areas. People are, before COVID, people were rioting last year against the government about this issue, amongst other things. It's a huge political issue. We've got Australian companies involved in it. Go to our website, read our releases. Just yeah, it's like we just need to get it. We're also still trying to raise money. I hesitate to ask activists for money, but the issue is that we don't just have the legal fees to pay, which are considerable. All of these cases are ridiculously expensive. We also need money to help support the reserve and the local communities around afterwards. That's the employment of local communities as park guides, etc. That's helping the local communities develop their own ecological economies, because the mining companies are right through that area, and they're dividing and conquering and offering jobs that don't exist and splitting, you know, people off again, you know, doing the usual things that mining companies do. They're doing a great job, the mining companies. So we need to counter that. To do that, we need funds. So I'll put a link to that in case anyone feels cashed up right now. Apart from that, yeah, we're just waiting for a ruling. it's not going to be the end of the story. If there's a loss, it'll be still a precedent. We're just going to have to keep fighting on other, keep supporting these groups to keep getting cases up, basically. Yeah, and Carlos has been putting, well, the Intag rights of nature case is a really important precedent as well to be aware of. So
both of these cases will be having quite large developments around Christmas. So keep watching that space and provide any support you can and stay tuned to hearing what's happening in that space. Thank you so much, Liz. We will now be crossing over to Michelle Maloney.
Hello, I am here.
Right. Just trying to find you to spotlight you.
Oh dear.
Oh, there you were. Aha. Great. And thank you for joining us. I'm very excited to have you with us. Dr. Michelle Maloney is the co-founder and national convener of the Australian Earth Laws Alliance. Also Adjunct Senior Fellow with Law Futures Centre, Griffith University, Director of the New Economy Network Australia and Future Dreaming Australia. She advocates for system change in order to shift industrialised societies from a human-centred to an earth-centred governance system. Thank you so much, and I'll hand over to you, and then we'll be going to some questions in about 20 minutes. So feel free to start putting more in through the chat if you'd like, people. Thanks
so much. Thank you for the invitation to join you. And as Carlos said, absolutely power to you guys for organising a Beyond Mining conference. So important to challenge extractivism. So I would like to, I had a couple of questions put to me, and I thought if it was okay with you guys, I'd put them in the context of a short presentation. Some key questions were, well, what is Earth jurisprudence and how does it connect to rights of nature? What's happening in Australia, and what are some of the challenges and opportunities that we're looking at in the rights of nature movement more centrally? So sorry that I'm the only one showing slides, but I'm actually really visual, and I find some of the images speed up the explanation of some concepts that can be quite complex. First, I'd like to acknowledge country. I live in beautiful Brisbane, in North Brisbane, which is the traditional lands of the Turrbal people. The Brisbane region is always acknowledged as the Yagara and Turrbal people's land. I always like to acknowledge the elders, past, present, and future, who cared for millennia for this beautiful part of the world and for the entire continent. In my work, I also like to acknowledge the ongoing impacts and legacy of colonisation, and acknowledge my role as a descendant of the people who stole land, the Irish, the English, and others, and my daily commitment to being part of the decolonising process in the work that we do in Australia. In our humble contribution, it's very, very important to me personally. One of the questions was, when did I first come across rights of nature? I met and fell in love with earth jurisprudence and rights of nature in 2009 at a wonderful conference hosted by Professor Peter Burden, now professor, then PhD student. And it was in fact that conference where I was introduced to earth jurisprudence, rights of nature, and fundamentally, life-changing, ground-changing concepts for Western law that drove us to create the Australian Earth Laws Alliance. We are deeply committed and interested in how we change the systems of Western industrialised societies so that we can be earth-centred, so that we care for each other and all of the creatures and earthlings on this beautiful planet. To us, rights of nature is one of the many possible ways to stimulate systems change. And in a moment, I'll talk about some of the ways that it can be used as a spearhead concept and a practical tool. But in Australia, we have the particular cultural context of a colonised land. If you're introducing rights of nature in Europe, you've got your own challenges. If you're looking at rights of nature concepts in Australia, you've got a very particular cultural context. And I'll talk about it a bit in a minute, because it's actually very, very important for the rights of nature movement in Australia and globally to be aware of what it's trying to change and what's appropriate for the place. So firstly, what is earth jurisprudence? Jurisprudence is a big flash word for a theory. So if you've got a feminist jurisprudence, you've got a theory of law that looks at the legal system from a feminist point of view. You'll look at certain decisions by male judges and critique it as a feminist. If you've got a Marxist jurisprudence approach, you'll be looking at things in terms of material impacts of capitalism and workers' rights and such. So earth jurisprudence, and I'll talk a bit about it in a minute, is really just a theory of law or a theory of governance that takes the whole thing from the perspective of the living world. And when you apply this earth jurisprudence to modern Western law, you get a profoundly different worldview. And it's actually really important to unpicking some of the systems in Australia is to actually understand little bits about what it is we're tackling and what it is we're trying to do in its place. In a nutshell, earth jurisprudence is all about shifting industrialized societies from a human-centered and human hierarchically privileged position, the image on the left, towards a deep understanding of the true story of life on Earth, which is billions of years of evolution, and the fact that we are merely one of many members of the Earth community. Now, to many of us on this call, that sounds like complete common sense, but when you look at what Western legal systems, Western economic systems, and the rise over the many hundreds of years since feudal times of European views on law, hierarchies and such, you couldn't get a more different juxtaposition of ideas. Just a quick reminder, the term earth jurisprudence was actually coined by a wonderful older gentleman, now passed away, Thomas Berry, renowned for being a great thinker, deep ecologist. He's written many books, but in 1999, this book, The Great Work, actually brought deep ecology into a critique of the governance systems that drive our current Western system or industrialized system. He looked at all four, what he called the four fundamental establishments that control human affairs: law and government, economics, education and religion. And he said that they are all fundamentally anthropocentric or human-centered. And again, we can brush that over and go, yes, of course it is. But if you actually think very deeply what a system looks like, the current legal system that demolishes the living world without a second glance is the natural progression of deep anthropocentrism. If you think it's all for us, we can rearrange the landscape as if it were furniture. If you actually look upon plants and animals as relatives and beloved friends, evolutionary companions, you wouldn't allow the kinds of destruction that we see from mining, logging, extractivism, pointless residential development, the use and extraction of oils and petroleums, and the vast mega waste of plastics that we're now seeing launched into our beautiful oceans. So at its most basic, Earth Laws is about exploring and challenging the ideas that lie beneath Western industrialized society. And I stress Western industrialized society because in a moment, I really want to remind us, any of us who are from the settler folks in Australia, what we're doing to address rights of nature issues still has to be taken in the context of colonization. It's actually very important that we understand some of these implications. From a Western legal point of view, rights of nature laws are profoundly just about changing the legal status of nature from being human property to being recognized as rights-bearing entities. Now that's the legal aspect. The rights of nature movement is broader. Often it's about people talking about social and ecological justice, but at its most basic, many of the legal aspects are about changing the legal status. And what someone asked in the questions, are there other precedents for rights of nature laws? It's one of the most rapidly moving and developing legal movements in the 21st century. I won't go through any of these, but there is a lot more going on than many people understand. Everything from laws in Bangladesh, Uganda, emerging developments in Bavaria, in Germany, people looking at the Pacific Ocean, tons of stuff happening. And I'm not going to talk too much to this slide, but just a reminder, from the Western legal point of view, all of nature is just a commodity. I know that we all know this, but it's really important when we're challenging the commodification of nature in the West to realize that First Peoples and First Nations peoples don't have that view. And if we're going to start to develop better laws in Australia, we need to acknowledge that their legal system is very different and we don't have to impose rights of nature laws onto First laws. Although this is a very speedy overview of stuff, and in a minute I'm going to introduce what's going on in Australia, I just wanted for anyone who's listening who really doesn't know what's going on in the rights of nature movement, it's probably very helpful to think of rights of nature as a core concept that has recently branched into two big branches from the same tree. in terms of legal aspects and legal application. On the one hand, you have what we call rights of nature across a jurisdiction. We see that in the Constitution of Ecuador, the laws that I understand haven't been implemented very strongly in Bolivia, new laws in Uganda, the local laws that started it all in the US in the early 2000s. But what we've also seen since the New Zealand developments, and many people think about this, is a different approach altogether to rearranging the legal status of nature. The simplest way to think about it is ecosystem specific. And I'll come back in a moment to what's been going on in New Zealand, because it has, and I've been working on this stuff for more than 10 years, and we saw after the New Zealand Whanganui River was recognised, a profound shift in a lot of Australian way of thinking about the potential of rights of nature. But I guess I just want to stress, rights of nature is often a term used very generally, but it's not always the term that's relevant, particularly to ecosystem specific laws. Many interviews and articles with folks from the Whanganui River, they do not see their laws as rights of nature laws. They see them as first and foremost first laws, bringing custodial responsibility for the Maori people back to their place. So what's going on in Australia? And the question to ask is, what are rights of nature laws in this place? Are they relevant to Australia, or should we be paying attention to Aboriginal people's first laws? Or is there a big mix up and there's cultural legal pluralism at work here? So from the Australian Earth Laws point of view, from AELA, we recognise the legacy of colonialism and imperialism. We must act to address it. And some people are arguing, there are articles both internationally and in Australia, that rights of nature can in fact be used as just another form of colonisation. So the thing to remember is that our beautiful continent, our lovely society with its straight lines, our laws that we bring in at certain levels, whether they talk about rights of nature or not, are still fundamentally from a Western construct. And in fact, the Aboriginal people's first laws, which have been around since time immemorial, are still in place. And if we impose a rights of nature law across a jurisdiction, where does that put Aboriginal peoples and their legal system? So a couple of perspectives. I'm not going to tell anyone the right way. There's lots of different ways to think about this. Just a couple of things. Many years ago now, the Northern Murray-Darling Basin Aboriginal First Nations Federation included a pledge to uphold the rights of Mother Earth in their constitution, and their document frames rights of nature the same way many folks around the world do. Recently, the Yarra River Protection Act was passed. It is not a rights of nature law. A lot of people think it is. It's a profoundly important piece of legislation in Australia. It's the first law that does two things, I guess: recognises an entire river as a living being, and recognises the profound connection and custodial responsibility of the First Nations peoples. And its creation of the Birrarung Council is a very important development. However, the Crown still has fundamental ownership of the river and the river system, etc. But this is a very, very important first step for many issues around recognition, and I think a lot of groups are going to build off it. Just with the short amount of time available, wanted to refer anyone who's interested to look up recent articles by Virginia Marshall and Anne Polina, and older stuff by Irene Watson. These are all incredible Aboriginal First Nations people, women, academics and activists, writers. Virginia Marshall's perspective is that rights of nature is coming from a flawed place, and that it can in fact be used by Westerners to simply roll the rights of nature over the top of both the rights of First Nations peoples and the custodial obligations of First Nations peoples. Anne Polina has recently written an article with Erin O'Donnell and I think Alessandro Palazon about maybe what we should be looking at are the rights of ancestral beings. And this is a gentler way of looking at a rights of nature approach in Australia. And people like Irene Watson are quite adamant that we already have a legal system in Australia. It predates 1788, and we don't need any of these other laws. So where does that leave us? There's still a lot of potential, and this is kind of answering the question around challenges and opportunities. Last year, Diane Evers, who's a wonderful Greens MP in WA, wanted to introduce a rights of nature bill. So we worked with her, and in one way, it's not a perfect thing because it is in fact an explanation of a bill at a state level to overlay other laws to recognise the rights of nature, but it has special provisions recognising First Peoples' privileged and priority position in the space. But it's not perfect. But it was the first time in Australia that anything to do with rights of nature was discussed in a parliament, recognised in Hansard. It's a really great start and stimulated surprisingly positive conversations amongst non-Indigenous people. Earlier this year, the Blue Mountains Council resolved, this was after a lot of work that AELA was doing with local people, exploring what rights of nature could look like or could mean in the Blue Mountains. Ultimately, the mayor picked up the concept, and the Blue Mountains Council itself is the first council in Australia to explicitly say it's going to look at what it might mean to incorporate rights of nature into its practices and operations. This is very, very interesting for Australia, and I'm waiting on the next stage of their own explorations. Only a couple of months ago, my organisation, the Australian Earth Laws Alliance, launched a very important report, not because we wrote it, but 230 pages of First Nations and local community people living along the poor old Barker-Darling River, which has been slowly killed for many decades. One of the recommendations in it is that all the river communities work together with First Nations leadership to try to find a way to articulate the rights of the river to live and be a river in the face of terrible irrigation and over-extraction, floodplain harvesting, water theft and political corruption. So this is a very important space, and there's a lot of work will be happening in 2021. And if anyone's interested in supporting a really deeply grounded and First Nations led process in exploring rights of nature potential in Australia, please do get in touch, because this will be a very interesting space next year. The other thing I wanted to mention is that my work with Mary Graham, who, if anyone knows her, she's an incredible Indigenous elder, one of Australia's leading thinkers, philosophers and political scientists. If you don't know of her, please Google her and try to find any YouTube of Mary talking about First Nations governance. She will educate you in a way that she blew my hair back and continues to do so. We, Mary, myself, some other Indigenous and non-Indigenous partners have created this organisation to explore ecological knowledge and first laws and how we can use them to transform the Australian system completely. Challenges and opportunities, again, I would stress local, local, local. Absolutely support our international cousins and get involved with Liz and the others. But if you really want to engage in rights of nature ideas in Australia, start thinking about what it looks like if we follow First Nations leadership, if we understand their governance structures and support them. Have a look at the Birrarung Council and how it works. And please get in touch with us. If you've got any interest in this, AELA is 100% volunteers. We're all very passionate about changing the system to care for the continent. And there's a number of emails there that I can also put in the chat. There are profound opportunities in this country to engage in any conversation that challenges the pro-growth and neoclassical economic mode that is destroying and everything from land clearing to allowing coal mines to continually treating plants and animals with disgusting disrespect. If you'd like to be involved in a multidisciplinary approach to any of that, get in touch with us. And if you're looking to get in touch with anyone else, if we can help you, we definitely will. That's me. I hope I haven't gone over time, but that's just a speedy overview of some really big and important things to think about. And that is a blue-banded bee. It lives in my garden, and I always like to begin and end with country. It is my deep and passionate love of the creatures, big and small, that helps me as a dumb old lawyer keep focused on the work in spite of the terrible things that are going on. So enjoy my blue-banded bee, and I'll stop talking. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Michelle. And there's some excited comments coming through. It is an extremely exciting area, the rights of nature. And I'm just going to put in the chat now a resource that was made in collaboration with AELA, I believe, by Aviva, which is a set of modules, I guess, to study the rights of nature. So I think there's 3 different sections that everyone's welcome to utilise that. I checked in with her and she was quite happy for that to be shared. It's a resource just to help educate people, and we'll have some links to some of those people that you've mentioned there. So that's fantastic too. And we will go into a bit more of a discussion. I did just want to quickly share a video that has come through, if I can get it to work, that is from related to the rights of nature movement. It's a 1-minute video. Bear with me, and then we'll have a bit more of a discussion about the rights of nature as a whole. Thank you.
The rights of nature movement has grown very fast, especially since Ecuador was able to introduce in its constitution the guarantee of the rights of nature. But I really like the relationship with the abolitionist movement, because the abolitionist movement was thinking and pushing towards a recognition that slaves have rights, that slaves are people. Of course they're people, that slaves cannot be treated as an object, they need to be treated as a person. And we are treating nature as an object. We, with environmental legislation, are only telling how many times can you hit your slave? So how much can you contaminate or pollute a river with mercury? You're just putting the levels of how much to contaminate, how much to hit your slave. And with the rights of nature movement, what we're trying is to liberate nature and consider it that it's not an object, that is a subject of rights, and that we need to completely change our relationship with nature.
Sorry, this is the bit I always stuff up, how you stop sharing. Oh, there we go. So we'll go back to a bit more of a discussion about the rights of nature. I just wanted to share that 1-minute clip drawing the connection between the rights of nature and the abolition movement, which I think is really interesting. And there's two arms that I see really with the discussion around the rights of nature in the Western legal context. And those two arms are, or pushes, I guess, are for the rights of nature and also for the Stop Ecocide movement, which are very linked. So these two movements are, I think, very important for people to be aware of. Thank you so much for discussing the issues, or touching on some of the issues with assuming that the Western legal construct is the way for this development to occur. There's obviously the rights of nature as a concept is not a new concept that the West has invented at all. And in fact, when we were speaking with Monica Feria-Tinta, the Peruvian lawyer that Liz mentioned before, I did ask her if she thought the rights of nature were inevitable and an inevitable progression, and she laughed and said that, well, it's not really progress, it's really about remembering what Indigenous people already knew and finding a way to link that into the dominant system at the moment. I wondered what your thoughts were, Michelle, on the idea that, are the rights of nature inevitable?
Well, that's a great question. And firstly, yes, they're not new. It's just that the Western world has never, ever seen the living world in the last many hundreds of years as anything much other than human property. Do I think that some shift towards an earth-centered worldview and way of being is inevitable? I would like to think so. I would like to think if humanity survives the oncoming changes and climate change, that we will look back on the fossil fuel age the way we looked back on the Bronze Age and the Stone Age as a period of time where certain things happened. In the whole history of humanity, many people would argue that this current time in the West of seeing the living world as property and seeing humanity as superior to all things is actually an anomaly. It's unusual, throughout the rest of time, throughout the rest of culture. Many other people did see nature in a different perspective. I personally, as an Aussie, am completely convinced that Aboriginal peoples had it right. I think they were never obsessed about rights. That was always about obligation. Mary Graham talks about the relationist ethos. The land creates us. We have to care for it. It cares for us. Caring for country and caring for kin is in their DNA, but it's also in their culture. Mary Graham talks about how from an early age, children were taught empathy. They were taught how things fitted together. and they were greed or any other aspects that were unpleasant and not pragmatic that would cause harm to the communities was looked down upon and discouraged. So I think returning to some deeper respect for the living world, for moral reasons, for practical reasons, and for the sheer love of our plants and animals. Surely the crisis at the moment is showing people that's the only way forward. So that's my answer.
That's great. I'd love to throw that question to both Liz and Carlos as well, of what your thoughts are and whether you think that the rights of nature is an inevitable part of our future.
I think so. I would like to think so. I think there's going to be a tremendous amount of pushback from corporations, from that other world. And it's not going to be easy. Not going to be easy. It's already starting. And here's something that I think in developing countries they're already working out the blueprint. And a lot of it has to do, and I think Michelle, you hit it. You had it right. It has to do with a lot of community, local relation to the nature. And that's one of the things we focus on is education. We need to really re-educate the people so they look at nature differently. Because if people on the ground don't realize it, if they don't really understand why these things matter, why it's important for all of us to respect nature, to change that perspective. If people on the ground don't understand that, it doesn't matter how many laws you pass or how many constitutional measures you put in place. If people on the ground don't understand that, all these conservation measures will fail. So the rights of nature is slowly coming into it's slowly changing the paradigm. It's very difficult. We have to be honest about it. It's going to take a lot of work. It's going to take decades, I think. But every victory like ours, and hopefully like Los Cedros will soon be, is one step towards that inevitable future, but it may be far in the future.
And Liz, did you have something you wanted to share on that as well? What were your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, to me, echoing the thoughts of Michelle and Carlos, I mean, to me, rights of nature is very much, well, I mean, whatever we call, I think the whole thing that we call maybe earth systems jurisprudence, not just the rights of nature, but this movement is inseparable from social justice, from climate justice, and from Indigenous sovereignty. Looking at, basically the ways of being of First Nations peoples around the world having being seen in a rightful place as having precedence over the Western systems that have caused all our destructions. I guess there's kind of an urgency in there, and that's a tricky one, because I listened to the decolonisation discussion yesterday on the ZIMARC conference, and talking about how environmental organisations in particular are going, oh my God, we've got a climate and ecological emergency and we've got to act now, and in doing so rushing and forgetting to really stitch it all together and look at the justice issues and the issues of colonisation. So to me, it's all completely interwoven. It's a decolonisation process. It's one expression of a really complex decolonisation process that needs to happen at all systems, everywhere, worldwide, and at the same time locally place-based, but in every local place, and that we're all doing different. Yeah, we're all doing different.
Really, but it's mainly focused on Ecuador and Australia. Really interesting.
Sorry, so just check, ask people to just check that they're muted. Just some other audio was coming through then. So we don't seem to have many questions coming through. Somebody was asking if it's possible to keep the chat, because there's been a lot of links that have come through the chat box. Everyone can save that individually if you like by clicking the 3 dots next to the chat section. So if you click there, you can select Save Chat, and you'll be able to get all of those links that have gone through. There's a lot to follow up with there if you are interested in getting further information and getting involved further. And I also want to thank you, Michelle, for explaining jurisprudence more thoroughly to me. It's a concept that I have struggled with, and that was a very clear explanation. Thank you so much for that. So this is, we're at the IMARC conference. Oh, there's my dog. And that's really distracting. Sorry. And it's fantastic to be here, and there's so much going on, and all of these different elements. As you mentioned, Liz, this is part of a broader movement. It's about decolonisation as well. It's about looking at how a lot of our systems work. But I do think that this legal framework and the rights of nature and the ecocide movement are a very powerful aspect of this movement as a whole, and could really add some safeguards. We know there's going to be huge pushback from corporations, as Carlos mentioned. So the more that we can strengthen and support these laws and people's support for these laws, the more power we will have in this dominant structure that is able to push over a lot of these other rights that most of us can see. So perhaps I'll just ask you all briefly if you would mind finishing up with some comments about the ways that you think people can best support this movement as a whole. Michelle, if you wouldn't mind starting off, that would be great.
Sure. Firstly, I agree, completely with Liz and Carlos. The Los Cedros hearing or case and all of the work with that. Please do get in touch with Liz and support them in the work that they're doing. It's really, really important. I think in Australia, there's already so many excellent organisations out there doing terrific stuff. Maybe my argument to you would be, or suggestion, sorry, typical lawyer arguing. No, my kind suggestion might be to connect with existing organisation and ask them what they think they're doing to help build an earth-centred system. Because I think in the past, a lot of our wonderful environmental organisations have been consumed with stopping the bad stuff. What's important is that we build the good stuff, we build alternatives, we build a better way to go forward. And I guess the other thing I'd like to mention is that the New Economy Network Australia, NENA, Nat and I have given talks there before. It's arisen out of the need to say to the large scale industrialized world, two things: we have to care for country, we have to care for the living ecosystems upon which we depend, but we have to do it in such a way that still supports with compassion other human beings. So I think trying to think of just transitions away from extractivism and away from mining and towards caring for the earth at whatever works in your local area, those conversations can be very tricky but important to have. So sometimes in Australia, rights of nature isn't the concept to come in with, to lead with, if you're dealing with people who are frightened for the future. Sometimes a new economy conversation opens up different alternatives for having a livelihood whilst still caring for country. So there's a lot of different ways to think about the same issue. I don't know if that's answering the question, but I think there's a lot of positive things we can latch onto in a time of change and transition that we're seeing today.
Thank you, Michelle. And Carlos, what would your advice be? You obviously been innovating in organising around this in different ways for decades now. What advice would you give to people wanting to support this?
I think the most important thing is to be more educated, to be more informed of what it really means to defend and promote the rights of nature. And once you're really informed, and if you become motivated, you will find a way to plug in. And I get visitors here from the US universities, and they always ask that question, what can we do? And I always say, start in your community, start in your university, what's going on there? How can you make that world better? And try to incorporate the rights of nature right where you are. Start where you are. The change happens, lasting change happens from the bottom up. I mean, it's great to have it in the Constitution, but people on the ground have to understand it and have to support it. And the way you do that is just by becoming more educated yourself and more personally involved. So that's where you start. And then you build up from the bottom up, always.
Great, thank you, Carlos, and sorry to leave you to last, Liz, no pressure. Did you have any thoughts that you'd like to share about the best way for people to support the rights of nature movement as a whole, or what would your personal advice be?
Yeah, I mean, it's funny. I mean, I was probably, just having some personal thoughts, sort of not triggered, that's not the right word, but it's propelled by some of what Michelle has been saying, and actually feeling a little bit downhearted actually, because I feel like, oh yeah, we've just been kind of swimming around in international waters, and we're not focused on Australia, and we're not engaging other groups enough, and we're not, and I feel like maybe that's probably what a lot of people do feel in this space. It's like, where do I sort of find something to latch onto and start swimming to, and I guess in some ways my thought would be to not, to try not to get discouraged by the fact that, I mean, we are, the environmental movement in particular is very much, it has been an atomized space, the activist movement, people burrowing away on their little issues. It's been like that for decades. The movement to coming together needs to happen, and but we're not there yet. It's like we all still are quite atomized, and a lot of it's around the time and the energy that's needed to network. I'd love to be having more discussions with AELA. It's just finding the time and the right spaces. I'd love to be doing more with the new economy folks and the working with down in Tasmania. We did start a process last year of talking with local Palawa mob about some rights for Kunanyi, which is the mountain that overlooks Hobart. And that sort of got a bit derailed by sort of COVID and the usual things. But starting those discussions with local people. Yeah, I just not getting discouraged. It's a really big, and helping each other, I think, encouraging each other on that path. We're all just sort of, finding our way here.
And can I just add, Liz, you should never feel down about focusing on the international. I mean, supporting a good process, any good issue is so important. And, we always wish we could do more to support the work that others are doing in other countries. We connect through the Global Alliance for the Rights of Nature and ALGA and others. But I think the best advice is go where your heart takes you. If you're a local activist, focus on the local. And if you're someone who really desperately wants to focus on other issues, just go where your heart takes you and latch on and work hard and do the next good thing. There's so much that can be done. And I guess I should have given AELA a plug. You're very, very welcome to get in touch with us. We have our Australian Centre for the Earth Laws and Rights of Nature. Next year, we'll be having webinars on the rights of nature with local speakers and others. We always need volunteers. We're not a campaign sort of group. We don't sign things and have petitions. We do work that shows viable alternatives. But you're welcome to become a member, join with us, support Liz, get involved. Maybe think of Liz as the conduit to the amazing work and the groundbreaking work in Ecuador, and AELA as the group that stays connected over there, but is really grappling with the issues here in Australia. And we could use all the help we can get because we've got no funding. We just work because we're passionate. So there's always something good that can be done.
So plenty of opportunities for people to get involved and engage with the rights of nature movement as a whole. Thank you all for being a part of this panel. It's really inspiring and very like it's the most exciting thing I've heard about for years, to be honest. I'm so engaged and passionate about all of this. We'll pass over to Natalie Lowry now to close the event, and I think she had a couple of comments to make and to just tell us a little bit about what's coming up next.
Yeah, hi to those who don't know me. I'm sort of part of the working group around the Beyond Mining Conference, and I have had the great honour of working with Michelle with the Yes to Life No to Mining Network. Know Carlos's work well, and am very close and passionate about what MRAG is doing with Liz and Neylan, and Rebecca's also here. I guess one comment I want to make to that, you know, where do you put yourself? I think it's really important to understand that the work that Liz and MRAG are doing and the work that, say, I do, which is focused in Papua New Guinea, and we're not using the term rights of nature for the very reason that Michelle has sort of mentioned, that the Melanesian context is its own context. And yeah, so it's more the river's right to life, I guess, that kind of thing. So the reason why some of us work in other countries is because Australia is complicit in the destruction that's happening through our corporations, through investors, through aid, through trade, etc. So we have to remember that these so-called borders, really the solidarity, the global solidarity is really important for what we're doing. And we just, yeah, I think to sort of Michelle, we just honour that there are different contexts and sometimes language has to shift because of that. And as long as we can respect that, I think that there is a broader movement internationally around this, and goes back to what both Michelle and Carlos talked about, which is, you know, education and shifting this extractive ideology, which just seems to be immersed in everything around us. So yeah, to finish off, I just want to welcome everyone to, you know, go to the blockadeimark.com website, go to our program tonight to follow on with this session. There's the Voices for the Matawara film, which I know Michelle would know because Dr. Paulina is very key to it. She's the chair of the Matawara Fitzroy Council. So in the film, they talk to the Fitzroy River as the lifeblood of their nation and on protecting their sacred national heritage listed Fitzroy River and its right to life from proposed invasive developments. So I think that would hopefully talk to sort of some of the things you were mentioning, Michelle, about the context here and the amazing work that they are doing there. It's really quite inspiring. So yeah, it's great to hear that we know this concept of rights of nature, nature's right to life, all these different terms that we can use is a really building movement. And yeah, I hope that we can all keep in touch. Definitely check out AELA, check out the MRAG website. I think they're all linked on the event page when you go into this session. Both do really amazing things. Like myself, we do so much volunteers. So as many of you to come on board would be awesome. So yeah, thanks to Nay for moderating and coordinating this. And thanks so much to all the speakers. It's truly inspiring, all the work you do. And I just hope in terms of Blockade IMARC that we will build on this and be able to collaborate more with the likes of AELA and MRAG into the future and not just do this in the kind of one event a year around the International Mining and Resource Conference. So there's some of us that are keen to kind of build a broader kind of space and dialogue around extractivism as a whole and the different sort of areas we're working in. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you, Carlos.
Bye.
Bye.
So,
Bye.